Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5 on Miranda Fricker's chapter, The Genealogy of Testimonial Justice. My name is Francis Hamill, and today we're going to explore Fricker's idea of testimonial justice as a virtue relating to the state of nature, why this is important, what it means, and conclude with what kind of virtue is testimonial justice. I feel like I should tell you right now that I have also put this slideshow up on the discussion board without the audio. I'm sure you can tell I've lost my voice, and if it's really annoying to you, it is on there without the audio available for you to look at. Okay, so starting with section 5.1, a third fundamental virtue of truth, I should say. Fricker is going to break down the state of nature into 3 epistemic needs based upon the works of other philosophers, and then she'll branch off to provide her own theory. So the first thing we need to do here is to define what the state of nature is. Fricker defines the state of nature as a method to construct a fictional scenario as the basis from which to draw philosophical conclusions about a given concept or institution. It is a minimal human society, and the focus is on epistemic needs, though other needs do enter the scenario, as we will see. It's important to note also that Fricker does mention this type of state of nature approach is typically used in political philosophy. Just something to be aware of. Fricker uses the works of 2 different philosophers as a jumping off point to explain the basis of the state of nature. Bernard Williams wrote his ideas in Truth and Truthfulness in 2002. He was an English moral philosopher, and Williams had used Edward Craig and his state of nature ideas as a jumping off point. Edward Craig wrote a 1990 book, Knowledge and the State of Nature, from which the argument of the state of nature as presented by Miranda Fricker comes from. Exploring the stages of the state of nature, Williams and Craig basically share the same first 2. When we look at these first 2 on Williams, they're going to coincide with what Craig also said. One is, as quoted from page 109, the need to possess enough truths and not too many falsehoods to facilitate survival. An example is in knowing the difference in foods you can eat versus those that are poisonous. Stemming from this is the need for collected, shared, or what Fricker calls pooled knowledge. You cannot be solely responsible for finding out what foods can kill you, for example. You can only find that out one time, and then you're not going to learn anything else. So you need to be able to depend upon others who have pooled their knowledge together in order to learn certain things about society. Now, this third point is where Williams and Craig tend to veer off in different directions. Where Williams strays is in this stage the need to encourage dispositions in individuals that will stabilize relations of trust. This notion births the virtues of accuracy and sincerity, both of which are very important to Fricker. She does take some issue with this notion, however, specifically on the emergence of truthfulness as instrumental, which will be clearer when she adds her own stage later in this section. But the most important thing that Fricker is going to add to this is that accuracy and sincerity need a third virtue with them. Fricker mentions that all of Williams' stages involve the speaker, but not necessarily the hearer, and questions if something else must emerge alongside accuracy and sincerity. She switches to Craig's third stage to see if that sheds some sort of light on the matter. Craig's third stage is the need for speakers to possess indicator properties, meaning they somehow are able to reliably illustrate that they are telling the truth. These can include having a solid background in being right about particular matters and having the best vantage point for particular knowledge at a particular time, or as I shorthanded it here, right place, right time. What this does is it allows for the hearer to be involved in the discussion of the state of nature, as she has to be able to understand and decipher these different indicator properties. Indicator properties don't mean anything if they're not presented to somebody who can decipher them. But it is also important to remember that with such things as scarcity and malevolence, which are natural in our society, deception can also be a factor. Therefore, there arises a need to discriminate between good and bad informants, and that is where Fricker comes in to add her 2 cents. So Fricker argues that even in the state of nature, we need an ability on the hearer's part to discriminate information without prejudice. Her solution is the addition of testimonial justice as a virtue. Capital T, capital J, very important distinction there. We need testimonial justice to accurately judge our pooled knowledge. This virtue is a counterpart to those of accuracy and sincerity, but while those virtues allow trust in contributing knowledge, testimonial justice allows us to acquire this knowledge. So, in other words, there's a lot of information out there, and there is bound to be more than one person telling you opposing viewpoints. Adding testimonial justice allows the person listening to all of this information to discriminate with it, to know what she needs to pull from each thing so that she can have her own knowledge. A departure from Williams and Craig in that it leaves little room for indicator properties, as there is a disposition in the hearer to avoid prejudice when judging the accuracy of information. The history of testimonial justice, lowercase, is seen clouded by prejudicial notions. Fricker illustrates this point by introducing us to Stephen Chapin, who provides insight into this sort of history with 17th century England, where trustworthiness was registered by how much of a gentleman one was. This diminished women and quote-unquote non-gentle men as being untrustworthy, oftentimes blatantly so. Fricker actually provides a little poem of the Elizabethan era, so you can see exactly how explicitly sexist a lot of the thoughts of the time were. And it's not only in this one example, it's not just in this century, in this area of the world. She just uses this as an example, but there are many other examples throughout history to see how this has happened. This indicates that testimonial justice is even more important for epistemic life in the transition from state of nature to historical society. Because as we see, without having that in the state of nature and bringing it into the real world, these kinds of things like 17th century England happen in their viewpoints of women and non-gentle men. So in the next section, we have here 5.2, a hybrid virtue, intellectual, ethical. Fricker asks whether testimonial justice is an intellectual or a moral virtue. There is a quote in here that I think is really great. It's by Linda Zagzebski, and it's great at answering the question of this virtue. I have it copied here. I'm going to read it in a moment. But it highlights Fricker's understanding that intellectual virtues have truth as their ultimate end, whereas moral virtues have good as their ultimate end. So Zabzewski's quote shows how virtues can have both ends. A virtue is a deep and enduring acquired excellence of the human person that includes both a motivational component and a component of reliable success in bringing about the end of motivational component. A motivation is an emotion disposition that initiates and directs action toward an end. The motivational component is distinctive of the particular virtue, but a complete taxonomy of the virtues will probably reveal that the immediate ends of the particular virtues are not ultimate, but that several virtues have the same ultimate end. For example, generosity, compassion, kindness, and charity ultimately aim at the well-being of others, even though each of them has a more immediate end. In the case of compassion, it is relief of the suffering of others. In the case of generosity, it is increasing our neighbor's possession of the goods of life. Intellectual virtues ultimately aim at the truth, but each also has a more immediate end, such as distinguishing reliable from unreliable authority, or gathering a sufficient amount of relevant evidence. The takeaway of this quote is different virtues have multiple layers, and because these clusters of different virtues have similar truths as their ultimate endpoints, there has to be something else to differentiate them. So Fricker goes on to give a few examples to illustrate her point of testimonial justice being a hybrid virtue. There are a couple pretty good examples in the book. I do recommend reading them. My favorite example that really shows this is the example of the social worker talking to the student. But the takeaway here, I'll just give you some key points that she wants us to take away from it, which is mainly this idea of neutralizing prejudice. First, there is no guarantee that epistemic and ethical ends will harmonize. Fricker thinks that this is a romanticized idea that there will always be some sort of union between epistemic and ethical ends. And she maintains that her characterization of testimonial justice does not rely on this false romanticism. Instead, her examples show a necessity for correcting prejudice in order to avoid missing out on the truth of a speaker and to avoid doing the speaker injustice. So those are the two different points for her. The neutralizing prejudice from the epistemic end is to not miss out on truths that are offered to you. And neutralizing prejudice on the ethical end is to avoid performing some sort of injustice to a speaker. In conclusion, Fricker's chapter on the genealogy of testimonial justice shows that there is a need for such a virtue not only in the fictionalized state of nature, but also in our society, and that using this political philosophy background can actually do us a lot of good for this sort of philosophy as well. Additionally, it is a hybrid virtue containing both intellectual and ethical ends, and its importance can be seen in her examples of the need to neutralize prejudice in order to achieve this hybrid virtue. I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps summarize Fricker's chapter, The Genealogy of Testimonial Justice. Thank you so much for listening. If you got to the end of this, kudos to you. I know my voice sounds horrible. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best.